The morning rush at Grady's Café was in full swing. The smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast filled the air as customers shuffled through the door, some on their way to work, others just there for their usual cup and a quiet moment before the day began. At a corner table, Thomas "Tom" Grady, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran, sat with his usual black coffee and newspaper. His hands, scarred from years of service and hard work, turned the pages slowly, savoring the quiet. He wasn't one for small talk, but the people in town respected him. Enter Jack Carter, mid-30s, expensive suit, phone glued to his hand. He walked in with purpose and entitlement, as if the entire cafe existed just to serve him. The city had made him successful, had made him believe that power belonged to those who spoke the loudest and took what they wanted. Jack didn't even glance at the other patrons as he walked straight to the counter, tapping impatiently. "Hello, can I get a double espresso, extra hot? I'm in a rush." The barista, Emily, a young woman who had grown up in this town, forced a polite smile. "Just a moment, sir." Jack exhaled sharply, rolling his eyes. "Small town service. Fantastic." Emily bit her tongue, but Tom, sitting just a few feet away, heard every word. He glanced over the top of his newspaper, but didn't say a thing. Jack took his coffee the second it was ready and turned, already sipping it when he bumped into Tom's chair. The coffee sloshed out, a dark stain spreading across Jack's crisp white sleeve. Jack froze, eyes widening. Tom glanced up, unfazed. Jack scowled. "Seriously? You just sat there while I bumped into you?" Tom took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Didn't realize it was my job to clear the way." Jack scoffed, shaking his head as he dabbed at his sleeve with a napkin. "Great, just great. First, I get stuck in this town, then I have to deal with some old guy taking up half the cafe." Emily's hands tightened around a coffee pot. A few of the regulars at nearby tables paused their conversations. Tom, as always, stayed calm. "Not sure why you're blaming me for your poor coordination." Jack laughed sharply, but there was no humor in it. "Let me guess, one of those war guys, huh? Bet you spend your days complaining about how soft my generation is." Tom set his cup down. The sound was soft, but it cut through the air like a gunshot. The cafe went quiet. Jack took a sip of his coffee, still fuming. "You know, I get it. You served. But you don't get a free pass to act like the world owes you something. Nobody cares anymore." The silence in the cafe turned heavy. Emily's jaw tightened as she glanced toward Tom, but he still didn't react. Instead, he slowly folded his newspaper, placed it down, and finally looked Jack in the eye. "You done, son?" Jack smirked. "Just getting started." What Jack didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his morning, and maybe of his life. The cafe remained silent. It wasn't the kind of awkward quiet that came when a conversation simply lulled. It was the kind of dense, heavy silence that felt like the air itself had thickened. People weren't just watching, they were waiting. Tom Grady didn't move right away. He let Jack stew in his own arrogance, let the weight of his words settle, let him feel the discomfort that he was too self-absorbed to notice before. Then, slowly, with the kind of measured control that only a man who had seen real chaos could possess, Tom leaned forward, his hands, scarred and weathered, folded neatly on the table, his coffee untouched. "You ever watch a man die, son?" Jack froze, caught off guard. His smirk flickered, just slightly. "What?" Tom's voice was calm, his gaze steady. "You ever look another man in the eyes, knowing he ain't gonna make it? Knowing there's nothing you can do but hold his hand while he takes his last breath?" Jack shifted his weight, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. He hadn't expected this. He had expected some bitter old man to snap at him, maybe raise his voice, but not this. Not a direct, piercing question that he had no answer to. Tom didn't blink. Ever feel the heat of a battlefield at 2 in the morning? The kind where you can't even see who's shooting at you, only hear the rounds cracking past your head? Ever wonder if the next step you take might be the one that sets off a mine? Jack swallowed, suddenly aware that the entire cafe was watching him. Emily, the barista, had stopped mid-pour. An old couple near the window had turned completely in their seats. Even the guy typing on his laptop in the corner had taken his headphones out. Jack tried to recover. He forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "Look, man, Tom didn't let him finish. "I was 19 when I got sent to Vietnam," Tom said, his voice like stone. I wasn't ready, none of us were, but that didn't matter when the first bullet flew past my ear. Didn't matter when I had to drag my best friend behind cover while his guts were spilling onto the dirt. Didn't matter when I carried a kid not much older than you on my back for 5 miles because the medics couldn't get to us in time. Jack's hands tightened around his cup. Tom leaned back slightly, exhaling. And you stand here, in your $1,000 suit, drinking your $4 coffee, telling me that nobody cares about men like me? Jack couldn't speak. He had spent his entire life believing that he controlled the room, that he was the one who dictated the energy of any interaction. But now, standing here, looking into the unshaken, unwavering gaze of a man who had lived through hell and survived, he felt small. Tom let the silence stretch. He didn't rush. He let Jack sit in it. Then, after a moment, he picked up his coffee and took a slow sip, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a passing thought. Jack felt the weight of the room shift. The smirks that had once belonged to him now belonged to everyone else. And he realized, too late, that he had just been given a lesson he would never forget. Jack Carter had never felt this kind of silence before. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of hush that made his skin crawl, the kind that told him he was no longer the most important man in the room. The cafe wasn't his anymore. Every set of eyes bore into him. Emily, the barista, her arms folded as she watched, disappointment written all over her face. The older couple by the window, their expressions unreadable, but their silence speaking volumes. Even the guy in the corner, the one who had barely looked up from his laptop earlier, was now staring. Jack wasn't used to this. He was used to being listened to, respected, feared even. He had built his entire career on being the guy who walked into a room and owned it, the guy who could talk his way out of anything. But standing in front of Tom Grady, a man who had nothing to prove because he had already proven everything that mattered, he realized something terrifying. Words didn't work here. For the first time in his life, Jack had nothing to say. He shifted uncomfortably, gripping his coffee cup like it was an anchor, something solid to hold onto as he tried to gather his thoughts. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his jaw tightening. He wanted to fight back, to reclaim some of the control he had just lost. But how? What could he possibly say to a man who had held dying friends in his arms? What could he argue against someone who had bled for the same country that allowed Jack to live his comfortable, smug life? He had nothing. The weight of his arrogance, of his complete and utter ignorance, settled on him like lead. Tom didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He just waited. Jack cleared his throat, trying to find something, anything, to salvage the moment. I didn't mean it like that, he muttered, voice lower now, quieter. I wasn't trying to disrespect you. Tom took another sip of his coffee, slow and deliberate. He set the cup down and tilted his head slightly, watching Jack like a man who had seen 1,000 versions of him before. You meant every word, son. Jack flinched. The barista exhaled sharply, shaking her head. A quiet murmur rippled through the cafe. The older couple by the window exchanged glances. Jack swallowed, his mouth dry. For the first time, he felt truly, deeply ashamed. His whole life had been about power, about talking over people, about winning. But this wasn't a debate. This wasn't some business meeting where he could bluff his way to victory. This was real, and Tom wasn't someone who could be out-talked. Jack shifted on his feet, his face burning, but he wasn't angry. Not anymore. He was humiliated, because the truth was staring him in the face. He wasn't half the man he thought he was. And the worst part, he knew it. Jack exhaled, running a hand down his face. He had two options: walk out and pretend this never happened, or face the fact that he had just been taught a lesson that no amount of money or success could have prepared him for. For the first time in his life, he chose the latter. He looked down at his untouched coffee, then slowly, carefully, set it on the counter. He didn't need it anymore, because he was finally awake. Jack Carter had spent his whole life believing he was in control. In the boardroom, in a bar, in any conversation, he dictated the energy, set the pace, and left people scrambling to keep up. But here, in a small-town cafe, standing in front of a man who had seen real war, real suffering, real sacrifice, he had never felt so powerless. His hands twitched by his sides, his mind racing, trying to find a way out of this mess. But there was no clever retort, no sharp remark that could erase what had just happened. The words had already left his mouth, and the whole town had heard them. Tom Grady just sat there, calm as ever, his face unreadable. Jack let out a slow breath. He had one last choice to make. He could turn around, storm out, pretend none of this ever happened. He could go back to his comfortable world, where no one challenged him, where respect was just something he expected instead of earned. Or, for once in his life, he could shut up and listen. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet Tom's steady gaze. "I was wrong?" The words tasted foreign on his tongue. Tom raised an eyebrow, waiting. Jack exhaled through his nose. "I said some stupid things back there, and He glanced around, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on him. "I don't know what else to say except, I didn't know." Tom nodded once. That much was obvious. Jack felt his stomach tighten, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. The silence stretched between them, heavy, but not hostile. For the first time, Jack wasn't trying to control it. He was just sitting in it. Finally, Tom leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping lightly on his coffee cup. "You ever been to a veterans hospital?" Jack shook his head. "You ever spoken to a man missing both his legs because he stepped on an IED before he even turned 22? Jack swallowed. "No." Tom nodded. "You should, and not for them. For you." Jack hesitated. "Why?" "Because respect," Tom said, his voice as steady as a rifle shot, "isn't about words, son. It's about understanding the weight behind them." Jack nodded slowly. "And I don't understand yet." "Not even close." Jack didn't argue. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to be right. He just felt the need to be better. He glanced at Emily, the barista, who was still watching him carefully. "What's the closest veteran center around here?" Emily's eyebrows rose slightly. She reached for a napkin, scribbling something down, then slid it across the counter. Jack picked it up and looked at the address. It wasn't far. Tom watched him, studying his face, as if trying to gauge if he was serious. Jack met his eyes. "I think I need to see what I've been missing." Tom smirked, but it wasn't condescending. It was almost approving. "You just might learn something," Tom said. Jack exhaled, nodding. Then, without another word, he grabbed his untouched coffee, turned, and walked out of the cafe. He didn't storm off, didn't run, didn't try to convince himself this was just another bad morning, because it wasn't. It was a wake-up call, and for the first time in his life, Jack Carter was actually going to listen.